welcome to the Dive Into Reiki podcast. Today, I'm super excited. I have a very special guest, Justin Stein, and I'm going to give you a little bit of his bio. The first thing is I should have called him Dr. Justin Stein because he's a PhD, but I'm taking the liberty to call you Justin from now on. Justin is an instructor in Asian Studies at Kwantlen Polytechnic University. His research program focuses on how exchanges within transnational networks have shaped spiritual and religious practices and ideas in the North Pacific region. His work on Reiki, including original translations of historical materials, has been published in 3 languages. His upcoming book, Alternate Currents, Reiki Healing, North Pacific Networks, and the Circulation of Transnational Spiritual Therapies, focuses on the life of Hawayo Takata, whose cultural translation turned Reiki from an obscure Japanese practice into a source of healing and spiritual transformation for thousands of Americans, Canadians, and other thousands of Europeans all around the world. So thank you so much, Justin. I know you're also a practitioner, but I was so impressed with those credentials that I had to give them the full beautiful length. So thank you so much for saying yes to this interview.
Thank you, Natalie. And I just sent off another thing to the publisher about the book, and I was like, that title is too long. So I actually, hopefully when it hits the market, it'll maybe have a little bit of a shorter title, but also, a beautiful introduction. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and well, it reflects...
Thank you for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here with you.
No, I'm very excited. It reflects actually the fact that you've taken a lot of care and work. I'm sure the title will shorten, and I didn't give it justice with my accent, probably, so some of the things. But I think, again, the reason I'm so happy to talk to you is, and I was very confused by Reiki history, right? I will Google things, and I remember a book that actually told me, like, aliens brought Reiki here, and then it was Christian, then it went to India, and then I don't know how it landed in Japan. It was very confusing. And all the sources are still very confusing. So I think having you here, because having that research background and all your knowledge is really priceless for all of us who are a little bit confused. And sometimes it affects even the way we practice, right? When we don't have a clear background of what the practice is about, can we really, really practice? Or do we get as lost as when I believe it was made by aliens? But which it may be, but I don't know, maybe you'll bring the evidence. I wanted to start, however, before we go into history, a little bit with your origin story. How did you discover Reiki and got interested in Reiki?
Oh, thanks so much. Yeah. I don't know how long of a version of the story to tell, but I'll try to keep it in the medium range.
That's good.
So first of all, I mean, my family, my mother particularly, has been a meditator since the 1970s. So I grew up with yoga and meditation and mantras and visualization as part of my development as a young person. Went to a healer who told us, wild stories about all kinds of energies and entities and all kinds of stuff. So I've been exposed to this world from a young age. And then in my late teens, early 20s, I began practicing a chakra healing practice called spiritual human yoga. And I got interested in what is this? On the one hand, it was, and I a little bit hesitate to use this word because I'm a professional researcher of religious movements and new religious movements and spiritualities, but it's what the common parlance would say is a bit cultish, right? Where the leader seemed to be a bit manipulative and telling people things that I thought were a little irresponsible, maybe, or manipulative. And so I got interested in, I felt this, phenomenon in my body when I did the meditations, something powerful, it seemed like, was happening in me. When I would put my fingertips on someone, wow, like we both would feel like really remarkable phenomena. But at the same time, it seemed like this organization was something a little maybe suspect and so I was interested in that phenomenon, and I wrote and received a research grant to go around the world looking at different forms of energy healing.
Wow.
And my research question was about the role of money in energy healing. And so under that auspice, I received Reiki initiations, first and second degree, while I was traveling, first in India and then in Japan. And then, and this was in 2001, 2002. And after that, you know, I also received initiations in other energy healing practices. I was practicing Qigong and different, you know, yogic meditations. And I mean, I was, you know, 22 years old, 23 years old. And that's probably the healthiest I'll ever be in my life. I don't know. Actually, I also got dysentery in India, but that's another story. So then I was just a practitioner for a while, you know, practicing on myself and some friends and my family occasionally. And then I just was like, what if I continued that research more? Like you said, the Reiki history was very unclear. I was interested in Jo-Rei as well, another healing practice with Japanese origins that has some similarities and some important differences. And so I ended up going to the University of Hawaii. My original project for my master's was going to be a comparative project with Reiki and Jo-Rei. And then my supervisor was like, it's too much for a master's thesis, just pick one thing. And so I started being like, okay, I'll do a project on Reiki. And then my chapter on the history of Reiki was just getting more and more complicated. The history was so, and people said, well, why don't you just write about that? And so that's what I ended up doing for my master's. And then for my dissertation, I just kind of went further with it and got to do all these interviews with you know, some of Hawayo Takata's earliest students in Hawaii, some of her students on the mainland. I got to work with her granddaughter and successor, Phyllis Furumoto, to set up the archive of her personal papers. And so I got to read all of these letters and go through all these photographs and the class lists. And so, yeah, I mean, I did a deep dive into that while also learning Japanese and reading, you know, the 1930s Japanese language newspapers from Hawaii and learning about that side of things, and also trying to dig up whatever we could find from the 1920s from Japan, like what texts are still there. And yeah, it's been really exciting. And through that research, I got involved with the Usui Reiki Ryoho Gakkai, the organization Usui Sensei founded in 1922, and then have been able to study under them, and had actually had permission to write about some of their oral history in some of my writing. So it's been a trip, and I feel very grateful to have been part of. I mean, I really feel very conscious and grateful that, like, at the end of the first century of Reiki, as there's like this global community that's growing more conscious of itself and trying to build these bridges between different parts of this giant global network, to be part of that process has been really a blessing.
Fantastic, and a blessing for us too that you chose Reiki and not Jo-Rei. Sorry, Jo-Rei people. But you know, it's because I think it can bring a lot of clarity. So we had discussed maybe about demystifying some of, like, or debunking some of the biggest myths in Reiki history. So I don't know if you want to start with a couple of yours or my selection.
I've got a couple, but I'm also interested to hear what you've got.
Oh, I have a list. Hold on. So maybe we should start with one of yours and see if it doesn't match.
Okay. So one that I've got, and I think, you know, this is maybe a little controversial for some people, but, like, you know, it's that, like, there's Western Reiki and there's Japanese Reiki, and that's those two things are very clearly distinct from one another. And I think that idea, right, it's kind of born out of this, like, Orientalist view, right, where, like, the East is the East and the West is the West, and they never meet and they never change. And, you know, we can actually learn, like, the traditional Japanese practice, and that, like, you know, that is, like, a thing that, like, the way it was done originally is, like, the right thing, and there's this degraded way that people have really, degenerated it, and it's corrupt now, and we need to purify it and like get back to the real original source. Like I sympathize with some parts of that. Like there are certainly people doing things under the name Reiki that, like, okay, that really doesn't bear much resemblance to what historically has been called Reiki. And so I can sympathize with the desire for kind of purification and drawing boundaries, and at the same time, Japan changes, right? That is not Japan, the way that the Gakkai, for example, practices today. It's not necessarily the way it practiced 100 years ago. And maybe that's good. Maybe that's right. That, like, our world is not the world it was 100 years ago. 100 years ago, they were really revering the emperor as a kind of god man, and saying, if you recite his poetry, your heart will like merge with his heart, and his heart is divine, and that will make you a better Reiki practitioner, because this divine, man has this incredible power, like a god, right? Where, like, as a kami, like, and it can inspire us to be. And I'm not saying that maybe his poetry has no potential for spiritual inspiration, but at the same time, like, it was clearly immersed in a kind of imperialist nationalist culture that I think is very different from the way most of us. I don't know if there are very strong Japanese nationalist practitioners out there who want to revive the imperial family's importance in Japan, but I think for most of us, right, we can maybe try to see what can be recuperated out of those older practices, and how could they maybe be adapted for our present age. And so I think a lot of the criticism of Hawayo Takata, right, that she changed things, I think a lot of what she was trying to do was, how can I make sense of this practice for my North American students who don't know anything about respecting authority, who are hippies, who, like, don't listen to me when I'm trying to tell them things, right? I need a new precept: honor your parents, your teachers, and your elders. Like, I need to tell them, hey, part of Reiki is like listening to your teacher. Like, that the exchange of energies and the story of Usui and the beggars camp, part of that is because when I talked to the older local Japanese practitioners in Hawaii, they didn't necessarily charge money for their treatments, but if they did a treatment and it was a good treatment and someone benefited from that, you got to be sure they were giving you stuff in exchange, right? Like, that was just part of their culture.
Yeah.
And again, maybe people are trying to get away with getting something for free. Oh, wow. Like that but so Takata, I think, really wanted to impress on her students, there needs to be some kind of exchange for appreciation, for gratitude, and that's a part of their healing. That if they aren't grateful, if they aren't, they're not going to necessarily change. And so, yeah, I think a lot of the, like, oh yeah, when Reiki left Japan, it started getting bad. Like, I think that I'm not gonna deny that there are things that have changed over the years that maybe are not in the best interest of the practitioner. Like, that's maybe clear. But at the same time, this, like, Japan is good and West is bad kind of distinction, I think, is a myth that I've devoted a lot of energy to working on.
I actually love that you brought it, because I always also like group Western Reiki as one, and they're actually like 140 different practices. And I think for me, like, the one thing that is wrong is you don't practice, right? So that for me, like, and you don't respect the system. Like, yeah. I think those are the two things. And I think, honestly, on both sides, there are people guilty of that. But I love that you brought that, because it is true. Like, and also, like, I'm not a Japanese living 100 years ago. I may do martial arts and fantasize and one, but I'm not, right? I live in Harlem. I take the subway. So how do I make my Reiki practice work for me every day here versus, in a society that was a lot more organized without so many rats.
So starting with something big and maybe controversial, but yeah, and I think there's this oh, I had a thing, and that now maybe it's gone. Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh yeah, no. The thing about practice, that for example, a lot of lineages lost certain practices that now have been refound and are regaining popularity. Oh, right, like meditation is great. Like, oh yeah, like chanting maybe, or like, some, these practices are very powerful and they were forgotten, but they were also replaced in certain like so-called Western Reiki lineages with daily self-treatment, right? That was became like the new, in a sense, from my way of understanding, became almost like the replacement for the meditation practice. You have to treat yourself every day, like that, right? And so, like you said, right, what's important, you respect your practice, you do practice, like those, that is something that can be common in many different lineages around the world, right? With that, yeah. So.
I love that myth that you brought and you debunk. I didn't even think about it, so I'm so grateful. Okay, so I'm going with one of mine, and I wanted a little bit to demystify that idea that he had no teacher. Obviously, he's the first Reiki system teacher, but that idea that almost like, oh, I'm walking and suddenly I'm in a mountain doing a meditation 21 days without food and water, but I've never practiced before, right? I just go there, boop, and now I can heal. So
Yeah.
I
Okay.
think is probably very interesting because you have some of the research material behind it.
Yeah. Okay. So it's a really interesting topic. So Usui Mikao, right? It's written on his memorial stone, was a man of great and broad learning, that he was interested in history, philosophy, medicine, psychology, in Christian and Buddhist scriptures, in physiognomy, like reading people's faces and knowing their personalities, in incantation, in like spell, magic, in the way of the immortals, right? Of like going up into a cave and doing maybe like qigong type meditation, right? So he was interested in a lot of things. He clearly studied things, right? On the other hand, in the Denju the Kokai Denju Setsume, in the Hike, right, in the thing that it seems like the big thing that Usui wrote, the question and answer thing, he does say, like, so I think it's in response, he gets asked, how does this work? Tell me about your therapy, like, how does it work? And he's like, listen, I didn't learn this from anybody. It's a wholly original therapy, and even I don't really understand how it works. I'm the founder, but like I went up into the mountains and I was fasting and the sky touched me or something. It's a little bit, how do you translate this? But like the air mysteriously inspired me. It touched me on the top of my head. And now I got this healing system. And like that, again, like you said, like that's not really the whole story, right? But I think that there are both of these aspects, and
it's also true, right? He did, and I love when you say sky. For Japanese, again, we don't understand. Sky has such a big meaning when the sky touches my head, right?
Yeah.
This big emptiness, the heavens, that spiritual energy. So we're sometimes very limited because of our lack of knowledge of Japanese culture. Mine is like this, yours is huge.
Yeah, no, actually, it's interesting what you said about emptiness, because I've been very interested in that. So like ku, like the character for emptiness, right, is also sora, is also the sky. It's not actually where it says in this particular sentence, but I've been trying to go down that route a lot, because in esoteric Buddhist philosophy, right, there's a real connection there between emptiness, which is like the nature of all existence, and the skies. I'm really interested in the universe, right? So uchu, right, that the universe is like the source of Reiki, or the universe is filled with Reiki. It's not entirely clear, but the universe and Reiki are importantly linked. And so yeah, that kind of connection with emptiness is something I'm super interested in. But yeah, no, it's funny because I asked the president and the former president of the Gakkai about this particular passage because it says taiki, like it's really like air. The air, he was touched mysteriously by the air. And I'm like, what does that mean? Like that he's touched, and I thought maybe it could be read daiki, as like a great key. I
Yeah.
was touched by a powerful key. And they're like, oh no, it's not that. It's taiki. And I'm like, okay, well, what does it mean there? And they're like, it's like the atmosphere. It's like the ether, an atmosphere. I'm like, yeah, but what is that? They're like, yeah, it's mysterious. It's mysterious. And I think that's part of what Usui's trying to say in that passage is like, yeah, I don't really know what Reiki is. Like, I just do it. And like, for me, like, that's a powerful teaching there
That
that
is
like,
beautiful. Yeah,
yeah,
don't trying to understand it with your head, just practice and feel it, right? And do it.
yeah, yeah. But I want to get back to one other part of the question, which is, and this was actually a recent insight for me. I don't think this is in my book, so I maybe I should put it in before it gets published. But so in the Takata story, right, of Usui, the master narrative, I call it sometimes, that like Usui is like looking in the Japanese sutras and he can't find anything about the Buddha healing. So he goes, oh, these are translations. I have to look in the Chinese sutras. And he looks in the Chinese sutras and he can't find anything. So he's like, I have to learn Sanskrit. And he looks in the Sanskrit sutras and there he finds like the formula, right? She says, and he knew he had to test it for himself. And he goes to the mountain to test it. And then, right, he has the experience with the light, and then he sees the symbols in the sky or something. She doesn't say that exactly, but that it confirms for him, oh, the formula works. Like that's what he saw in the sutras, right? And the story is a story, and she tells stories as teaching tools, and it's
Yeah.
not necessarily literally whatever. But you know, if you know about the symbols and like the origins of the symbols, right? The what's sometimes called like the mental emotional symbol or the second symbol has its roots in a Sanskrit syllable that's used in esoteric Buddhism in Japan, right? To
From Amitabha.
embody, to symbolize, one of the Buddhas or Bodhisattvas. And, he found a formula, like a Sanskrit formula, and he tested it out. And then he had this experience. Like, for me, it's like, oh, yeah, actually, like that story kind of makes sense in a new way to me that, like, the symbol is, in a sense, like a formula, right? That, like, and he learned this stuff and he tested it out, and all of a sudden he had this crazy experience, and he taught his advanced students these kind of secret sacred formulas. And it's like, oh, okay, like that part of Takata's story, like that for a long time I was like, oh man, like that's a good story, but like that's obviously not what happened. Now I'm like, actually it's kind of like a symbolic way of telling what happened, maybe that like he studied and he studied and he studied, and then he experienced, and then he realized this thing that I learned really works, and it's now part of the system.
But I love, as you said, he studied, right? Like he went in depth into the sutras, right? So like, okay, if I don't have the answer, so that means, and those sutras are freaking hard to understand. Like, I always need to have the book that explains them to me.
Right. But I think that could have been like a symbol, like like a metaphor. Like he
Yeah.
studied the sutras. Maybe he had some sort of esoteric master who he learned some practices under, like that's the way she told the story. But
again, they relate to that, to meditation, to emptiness. The sutras are again keys. And when you unlock the sutras, you gain knowledge and spiritual depth. So I like
the sutras themselves are stories, right? And they're stories that connect you, right? The idea of like it's like a suture, right? Like that it's like a thread, and it connects the practitioner to the Buddha, right? It's like the Dharma, it's this way of connecting, and in a sense, to our true self, right? To the bodhicitta. And so that through a story, right, through a metaphor, we actually find our true self or something, right? I think that there's layers there, you know?
And again, they're Japanese, right? So like in Japanese culture, you'll watch, the teaching is even different. So I study martial arts, and people in the podcast are tired of hearing me that. But they had to adapt the teaching to Americans, because if you don't tell us what to do, we're not trained to just watch and repeat. And it's a very different way of teaching, but they teach by showing, right? If you go to Japan to a dojo, they actually expect you to watch them, repeat, and then practice on your own for hours.
Right.
So I also think sometimes we assume like, okay, the way of learning is different, but that doesn't mean there wasn't studying, there wasn't learning, and there wasn't that effort behind it, right? And I say effort because it's not the kind of effort where you suffer for it, but it's part of the culture. Like in my dojo, if you don't train, you don't advance, but at least they're kinder, and we're more diverse. And they will say like, well, you're actually doing the sourcing wrong. At least they will tell you. In Japan, they may not even say that. They just go like, oh, you know? So I love that he studied his own way, the way they was then. And as you said at the beginning, we have to adapt things. We, as modern people in the West, we could never study the way he did, because it's a completely different way of learning. So
or the way he taught his students, right? That they're how, and like you said about they're very like kind in your dojo to actually tell you like, no, like that's not how you do it. Because if they don't say, like, you're not going to figure it out, because you haven't been socialized from a young age to be like, huh, my teacher isn't telling me anything. I bet I'm doing something wrong. Right?
Yeah, I'm supposed to figure out how to do it by myself by practicing for 24 hours in the winter with a sword, right? Like without shoes.
But it's interesting because if you listen to Takata's tapes, or or her students' stories, right? People will ask questions, and she'll be like, "Stop asking questions. Just look at my hands. Look at what I'm doing. Practice this. Do this over and over again." Like she has definitely that
Japanese teaching method, but at least she said, "Look at me and learn," right?
Right.
Yeah, I'm sure like in Japan, they will not even say that. They will just like, ah. Yeah. I love that answer. And I love how it ended up tying on the first one. So next you have another one. So we're going one on one.
Okay, so one thing is like that Reiki literally means universal life energy, right? Which is something Takata told her students.
It
right?
doesn't? Okay, now I'm like excited. I had the idea that was a valid thing.
The problem is like, it's a lot easier to be like, that's not a good translation. What is a good translation? Hard to say.
No, we have to talk more about what is.
All right, ki is probably easier in that like it's a more well-known concept. Yeah. But like there's a lot of criticism of the idea of ki being energy in different shiatsu or Chinese medicine, or that like chi or ki. Energy has a particular meaning, right? That like there's like, for example, there's like matter and there's energy, right? There's a kind of dualism in there. Whereas if you look at kind of ancient teachings about ki or chi, it's not that dualism. It's both. It's both.
We love that. Shinshin Kaisen, harmony of mind and body in the ki already. Oh.
Because like we are literally like made of ki, right? We are like, our form is ki, and our process, right? We are animated by ki, right? It's just that there are more, I think they call it like turbid and more like light kinds of forms of ki, right? That there's like,
well, that's quantum physics. That's basic quantum physics, what you're saying.
Yeah, but so there's like denser ki and there's lighter ki, but like, or what's the opposite of dense? Sparser ki? I don't know, but that it's all ki on some level, right? And so energy makes it sound like we could like measure it. It makes it sound like it goes from one thing to another thing, and it gets like transferred into it, and that like, and I think a lot of those things can be distracting from like actually like maybe like what ki is, and like you can get like attached to thinking about like that like flow transfer kind of thing. And like I know it's like very commonplace to talk about like you said, to channel. There's the universal source, and
Yeah.
I'm like a tube, and it like flows through me. But like I in my reading, the really early stuff doesn't talk about that at all. Like it does, but what does it say? It's very vague. Like I said, it's kind of everything's a mystery, and so it's like doesn't really. It's not a very satisfying answer. But um, Usui and the Memorial Stone as well talk about that there's like this like Reiki of the universe, and it's related to this Rei no. And Rei no is another hard thing to translate, but like, and it depends how you want to translate they. So actually, let me get to they first, and then maybe I'll come back around to this.
Perfect.
They, like the character they, can literally be spirit, right? It's tama, but it can also be other things that are not like spiritual, really. Like budeyaku, like mambyo no reyaku, the what I would say maybe the miraculous medicine that can cure all disease or something, the marvelous medicine. It's not literally like the spiritual medicine, because if you look up stuff from that time, aspirin was a reyaku. That like it's
Oh.
we might call like a wonder drug or like a miracle medicine or something like that.
Oh.
And so at the same time, they can mean spiritual. And that's where it gets confusing, is in some times when they're using it, it clearly is um, a dualist kind of thing as opposed to the body. There's a thing in there's a part of the Kokai Denju Setsume where Usui talks about like Rei Niku, so like spirit and like flesh, in a sense, a very dualist thing, and that like Reiki is good. It unifies them. The spirit and the flesh get unified through this practice. And so there is this kind of dualism which we need to like overcome, and so in that sense they can be like spirit. There's another funny one. A student of Hayashi's, this guy Matsui Cho, Matsui Sho. He's like, well, even though it's called Reiki, it can't be a spiritual practice, a Reiteki whole or something like that. Reiteki, I forget exactly, but Reiteki something. Because I'm not a good person and I can do it. He's like, I'm not like a spiritual, I'm not like a great religious leader, and I can do Reiki. So clearly it's not like spiritual, like Reiteki. So
yeah, it can, but
okay.
yes,
Okay.
but again, it
Yeah,
depends
yeah.
on how you use it, right?
I'm just giving an example of
Yeah.
some people at that time in the Reiki world were thinking of Rei as like spiritual.
Yeah.
But I think another way to think about it, and what my kind of academic mentor, Yoshinaga Shinichi Sensei, has told me, and he's like one of the big experts on like these type of practices at that time, is that Rei can mean like wonderful, excellent, kind of miraculous, marvelous, right? These things that were it's like
Yeah,
it's
wonderful.
amazing key. That could be like a translation is like amazing key, wonderful key. And that, so it's, as you may know, like in Chinese medicine, there are so many kinds of ki, right? And in Japan, right, you often talk about like genki, right? Your like vitality. And
Yeah.
so Reiki maybe is like this really wonderful kind of ki where if you are like touched by Reiki, and actually we're all, Yusui says this, we're all full of Reiki. All living things have Reiki in them, but that there's some way of maybe like awakening it or like realizing it, putting it into practice. And when that happens, when the Reiki that's innate in us and in our environments gets moving or whatever, awakened or something, then like everything else, I mean, in the language of the late 20th century, like reaches its highest potential or something like that, right? That like
To live your best life. Yeah. Being millennial speak. Yeah.
Exactly.
But I actually like this very much, because one thing I feel is like when we make Reiki very magical, for me is, I know it's very attractive because it feels like you're gonna have this high spiritual experience. But what I love about Reiki practice is actually very human for every day, right? Like I work with the precept when I'm really angry, and I can settle and get inside in myself. It helps me to feel better, as you say. It's like it feels good, wonderful. So for me, sometimes even though it is my spiritual practice personally, but making it more human and less spiritual magical, like I think is fantastic. I like the translation. And
Yeah. And
regarding students, I'm sorry to interrupt, like I'm
no, no.
thinking at the dojo, Iaido is a spiritual practice, but it's in the closet. But
Mhm.
you can do AI without being a spiritual practice. You learn how to do a katana, and a bunch of people just want to be samurais and they're cutting really hard. What happens is, yes, they become very good at the Iaido, but they don't get to the higher levels. So the last levels in Japan is actually about moving ki. And yeah, there is seme, there is ma, there is a bunch of like perceptions of ki, but again, it's a very normal thing. It's not like we're now spiritual people. We're just humans
Mm.
moving ki, like having an experience that should be normal and human every day. We just kind of don't pay attention to it. So I love that
Yeah.
story of the student.
Yeah. I was just thinking also about the like re whole, right? Which is a thing you see a lot in the memorial. And so if you a lot of times translate it again as like spiritual method, but again, if you think about it as being like this like wonderful method, right? And so um that oh, I had a connection that Usui taught this like wonderful method. And so the precepts, you were talking about not getting angry, right?
Yeah.
And on the one hand, you can think about that as spiritual development, right?
Yeah.
That to be in kind of control of yourself and your emotions, to be hardworking, to be grateful, to be kind. You could think of those as spiritual kind of virtues or values. Um, but you can also just think about it as like moral, like or like one like just being like a good person, right? Like it's and so I don't know. I mean, I think the word spiritual obviously like is a European word with uh its own connotations. And Rei is like, from Chinese origin, Ling in Chinese and Rei in Japan. And it has its own connotations. And actually, they share this thing about being spirit, right, on some level. But they also, I think, have their own connotations in their own place. And so, spiritual, I think, in our context, does have this dualist concept, right, where it's as opposed to the flesh. And there also is this kind of like hierarchy, like who's the most spiritual or something like that, like
I
can
know.
creep into that kind of language. And again, right, it's about breathing. It's interesting, and so like the spire on the top of the church, like reaching up, aspiring towards God, towards heaven, something. Whereas I think today I think there is something about like mystery there. And like they talk about when you walk into the mountains, there's like Reiki. That's like when you look up Reiki in the Japanese dictionary, that's one of the examples you always see is like the Reiki of the mountains, and like being
Oh.
in this mysterious kind of non-human kind of place where you're very like small and alone, and there's like things you don't know out there, and you're like surrounded by power, right? And again, I think there's overlaps with our idea of like spiritual, but I think there's also differences as well.
And again, it's a culture 100 years ago, Japan, right? That they are, I think when I was there, and again, I was there only for like 6 weeks, I was just shocked about interconnection with nature is everywhere.
Mhm.
Here is like, oh, interconnection, like the concepts that we see as very almost like from Reiki or from spiritual practices are everyday concepts over there. Like you go, and I went to a digital museum. It wasn't like I was in a highbrow thing or a temple. I was like in a digital museum, and everything was about connection, mind, body, it was the language that we use as like, oh, guru, right? So I loved that you say like we're made of Ray, right? Like our bodies, and the importance of including the body versus our tendency as Westerners to make spiritual outside of the body, which is then we go a little bit ungrounded.
Well, I think there is that in Japanese language too. Like the example I mentioned from the Q&A, he talks about it's like rei niku. It's like rei niku is like the spirit and body, and then it's like ichi nyo. It's like to unify.
Yeah.
Right. It's something they talk about, right, in martial arts as well, right? The shin
Kiken
toei.
Daichi. Yeah.
Yeah. Which one? Which one?
In my martial arts, is Kiken Daichi, comes from Kendo, the term, but is unity of sword, spirit, and body.
Oh yeah. Nice.
Yeah, it's cool.
Yeah. In some Aikido, right, there's shin toitsu. It's like the unification of mind and body, and a lot of times it's through breath and ki awareness and all this stuff, right? So.
But it's beautiful, and I think having aware that actually that was mentioned also in history. I'm not going to repeat the Japanese sentence, the ki niku whatever, because my memory for Japanese is. But that is a beautiful one.
Yeah, and so yeah, and I think that there is something to that kind of, even, you know, so we like to, you know, it's like dualism on dualism. In the West, we're so dualistic, and in Japan, they're so, you know, monistic.
No, they are, especially.
And but at the same time, in Japan, they're talking about like, yeah, like in our ordinary lives, like we're too dualistic and we need to overcome it. And also, right, the other thing being that like they were moderns, right? Early 20th century. So one of the things I found from the period, do you know what a theremin is?
No.
It's like a musical instrument you play without touching anything. It's got like it's like a electromagnetic field, and you move your hand through it, and it makes, they use it in like sci-fi movies. It makes like spooky music. It's like, and so you play it with your hand just kind of waving around in the air. And at that time, they called that the Reiki Koto. So like the koto, like the Japanese instrument that you play with Reiki.
Oh, beautiful.
Yeah. And so I need to find out, to do a little more research into that, but I found that somewhere and I was like, oh my gosh, that's so interesting. Because it was around the same time that it was being invented, you know, all these kind of discoveries into electromagnetics and radio and all this stuff was going on right at the same time that Usui was teaching.
And we forget that actually in Japan was so feudal for many years, and he was really born with the Industrial Revolution. Like, so he was really a very modern person who was bringing very new things. Like he's a totally, I love that. Because we say it's 100 years ago, but in Japan, like that age when he grew up was so important. Like I love that.
Yeah, that the village he was born in was really like the old time world, and that in his lifetime he saw this rapid modernization. Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
Amazing. I always find interesting how this practice like his came up when people felt isolated from their life, like, you know, and then we are having a resurgence of Reiki when we're having this digital revolution, right? Not when things were calmer. It's like that same disconnection for our lives.
That's really interesting. Yeah, that there's been rapid change, and so there's like this feeling of maybe like uncertainty and like maybe alienation, and so this like striving for connection, for groundedness, for maybe ritual practice. Yeah.
It's interesting. I have one more question, and then I'm going to go to your Reiki oops, because everybody has a Reiki oops. My last connection, and this, for the people who are a little bit more familiar with Reiki history, is kind of clear the answer, but a lot of people still believe the chakras are an integral part of the original practice. So I know it's kind of an obvious question, but I think, again, not all of us have trained with different masters or access. Again, Google can be very democratic in its information, to call it somehow.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I know. So yeah, certainly like the seven chakras. Very interesting story on its own about like how did that get codified? Because a lot of people say since for 5,000 years the Indians have taught about these seven chakras and they're all the colors of the rainbow. And actually, it's funny because that's a modern process too, where many different people have been describing the chakras in different ways over centuries, and it's only really in like the late 19th early 20th century that it starts to become like a very ordered system.
Oh,
So that's a
wow.
whole it's almost like a parallel story to that of Reiki, right? Where um you know of course, like in East Asia, like people have been healing with their hands for a long time too, and like is it all like Reiki, or is Reiki the system that really was systematized in the early 20th century? So anyway, that's a little bit of a tangent. But yeah, in Japan in the early 20th century, the seven chakras that we like think of, when we think of kind of the yogic body, were not widely known in Japan at that time. Usui certainly was not teaching that particular thing. If you look at the treatment manual, the hand positions in the handbook published by the Gakkai, which I was always wondering when was it first published. We found one where it really says the first edition was 1922, but we haven't seen the first edition. But we have seen one now from 1926. So
Oh, wow.
around the time Usui passes away, they were publishing this handbook, and the hand positions are not like, the you have to treat the seven chakras, like certainly like by any means. But there are interesting references to particular vertebrae on which aren't like, for example, like I think it's C7, the seventh cervical vertebrae is like often associated with like the throat chakra or something like that. And
Yeah.
it's not lining up exactly with the chakras, but the fact that they're referring to vertebrae by their kind of Western anatomical numbers
Yeah.
is pretty interesting, and maybe was a influence of chiropractic. Tadao Yamaguchi actually points that out in his book. I had missed that. I read that book several times over the years, and I had missed it until recently. I went back to it and I saw that, and I was like, good point. Like, because chiropractic was one of those things I was picking up in Japan at that point. So, yeah, but anyway, to return to your question, chakras was not an original part of the practice, but right, Takata, even though she didn't teach about chakras, she did read about yoga. She was interested in yoga, and she was very interested in the glands, the endocrine system, and the hand positions corresponding to different glands in the body. And there's been a lot of also kind of work on like chakras and like nerve plexes and glands and like linking all those things together. So I think like her focus on like these different kind of like plexes in the body may have been like the roots for like the next generation in the 1980s, linking it with chakras, and then it's taken off
Yeah.
since
And
there.
honestly, like when you think of the core treatment, like it does add up, like I don't work with chakras, but I still do those hands position.
Right.
So when people is like, did you do chakra balancing? Like, of course I did.
Right, because that's how Reiki works, kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also because I did place my hands there, like it's
Yeah.
fine, right? So it's, but
I
I
was
was,
talking with a friend. Oh, sorry.
no, go ahead, go ahead.
I was talking with a friend recently who researches yoga history, and I was talking about the Joshin Kokyuho meditation, and you know it's kind of like some stuff in qigong, but it's also like this yoga book that was translated into Japanese in the early 20th century, and it's also like, and he's like, well, the body, like everybody's working with the same body on some level, right? And so there's only so many spots in the body you could focus on, and I know some people like I think Franz Stina has talked about like the three diamonds as like
Yeah.
this like, and that goes back a long time in China, right, associated with like the three purities of Taoism, and like esoteric Taoist meditation, Qigong meditation. Again, was Usui studying that specifically and saying, there's the head center and the heart center and the lower belly center? Like, I don't have any evidence for that either, but like that at least is more of a East Asian common idea kind of thing. And also very popular at his time was this meditation where have you ever heard of the butter meditation?
Oh, where you imagine this hot liquid that melts and goes down and melts your spine?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was a very popular meditation that goes back to like the 18th century in Japan. But in Usui's time, so imagining that the hot butter kind of melting down into your head and down into your spine and go down into your torso, and it kind of like heals your body. That was a very popular visualization at the time, and it also kind of has a bit of this similar chakra scanning, chakra balancing kind of meditation.
And also bringing that energy to the hara, right? Like it's because at the end we may say whatever, but what happens is we overthink. We need to just bring it down here, and the gesture is there. There is something I love about what you pointed, right? So Sui, the C7, and like all of those references means he did have a Western influence. And again, I'm gonna use these terms with quote marks because I know. So in a way, like sometimes when we become very purist, that's like, why do we have to go back to original Japanese? Well, I think Reiki from the inception then had a beautiful crossover of techniques. As she says, Chinese sutras, Sanskrit sutras, like he had this chiropractor influence or some other influences. So again, we go back to like, we just need to understand the background and respect and practice, but being influenced is probably part of the core of the practice versus trying to be
purist.
Like I like, for me, like I'm a Japanese lineage because I like simple, right? So my practice has like 5 things. That's it. That's because I like to go deep. So I practice the same thing for 7 years. Don't ask me why. I have a passion for that.
Yeah.
But that's it. That's it. It's simplicity is one thing. But like, as you talk, I'm like, we cannot be purists. We have to be a lot more because it was born out of someone who was like bringing stuff together to create something completely new. So that's the origin of it.
Yeah, and I do want to actually make a footnote that we don't know that Usui was the one with the vertebrae. It could have been one of his students put it in there. The earliest I've seen this
so
is
maybe he was a purist and the students started missing out very soon.
No, that's not at all. Because from the memorial stone, it says he went to the West to study. I mean, it says he studied Christian scriptures. Like, he obviously was interested in Western things, not to say that he was the Christian principal of Doshisha University, as Takata said, but that there is something, preserved at that time, the time that he died, in Japanese, written for everyone to see on a big stone in Tokyo. It says this guy was interested in Western stuff, right? I mean, it's yeah.
And I love that you clarified that he's not a Christian doctor. Like, I learned that at the beginning, but
he's the biggest myths. I feel like enough people have talked about that. And I do want to say, we don't know. He may have gone to Chicago. We don't know that he didn't go to Chicago. There were, as Robert Fuston pointed out, there were a lot of different Christian seminaries associated with the University of Chicago, and some of them just don't have any records at all of who was studying there at that time. So it's possible he did go to Chicago to study Christianity. That's something I think we will never know. Yeah.
But another thing, when you talk, like, again, you said he studied Christianity, he studied all these things, right? Curiosity. So a lot of time, and you are curiosity incarnated, you're a researcher, right? I'm very curious. My thing is like, okay, why those have martial arts have to do with Reiki? What in common? How can I deepen? So I think also a respectful curiosity, right? Not just like this is, and I think depends on your brain, but having that curiosity of like, how can I go deeper? How can I make just this practice make more sense? I think it's also something we could bring to the practice.
It's interesting. So the very first time I talked to Phyllis Furumoto, she interviewed me like the way you're interviewing me now on Skype for her radio show.
Yes.
And after the talk, I didn't know what she would think of me at all, and I was very nervous about what she would think of me. And afterwards, she said, "You know, the kinds of questions you ask and the kinds of things you're interested in are so different from the kinds of things I'm interested in." She's like, I, the kinds of things that you want to know, like, really could not matter less to me. Like, but I recognize that there's a lot of people out there in the world who are like you, who want to know the answers to these things. And for them, your work is really important. And I want to support you on your path because I can see, whatever, that you
Yeah.
are someone who's well fitted to ask and answer these types of questions. And I thought that was a really powerful kind of thing. And you said before about how history can inform our practice, and I don't think that's necessarily true for everybody. That there are people out there who they get their story from their master in their training, and for them, that's enough. They don't need anything else. That they just want, like you said, want to dedicate themselves to this is the style that I practice, and I understand there's other ways of doing it, but for me, this is enough, and I want to do it this way. And I think that's great too. I'm not out here trying to tell anybody like, hey, like your teacher was wrong, you need to change. I understand that that's happening as a result. People are even, at the heart of some of these lineages saying, how do I honor what my teacher gave me and also recognize that there are new historical insights coming into being? And I think that that's happening, and I think that's also natural. But yeah, it's not my agenda to go out and say like, hey, like everybody has to stop doing this because it's wrong or
But
something.
I think actually what you gave us was the opposite. Like you gave us such a beautiful knowledge of being compassionate, of being open-minded, and understanding that already as its inception, it was a very creative, like someone who was very interested in many things. And I think it's the contrary. Like this knowledge is a little bit of freedom. And when I talk also curiosity, sometimes curiosity when we practice our own practice, right? Who am I? Because I think when you said like I can practice Reiki and not grow, but if you bring curiosity, like why do I get angry? Why do I still worry? Why do I? That curiosity can take many shapes, and I think it can, like sometimes when I can plateau in my practice, I've been placing my hands for 2 years and nothing's happening. Just change that filter a little bit, right? Like, and I think you gave us like so much information that can act as that moment where you're like a little stuck or a little bit judgy, because sometimes as Reiki people, we're a little bit judgy of others. What you gave us was such a beautiful, hey, there is no right or wrong, just practice. Even the history is not completely certain of anything. So I really, really appreciate. But not anyone can live as perfect guests here who never make a mistake and they're a source of wisdom, even though they are.
Yeah.
I really, I and people know I share, like I learn by mistake a lot. Now I'm trying to learn from other people who know a lot more.
Yeah.
But a lot of I experiment a lot and I have made a lot of mistakes. I'm really grateful because it allows me as a teacher, practitioner to actually make it very approachable. So I wanted to know if either in your personal practice or in your search, was there someone that you assumed something or did a mistake, again, quote mark, that
Yeah.
actually gave you a huge insight, like, oh my God, that was completely different than I expected, or wow, I'm going deeper thanks to this.
Yeah. I think if I could do something, maybe like a mistake I was making in my practice that
Yeah.
like it really, so um this was in 2002, and I was at a Reiki share in Kyoto, and I was very, I was practicing all my Qigong, I was practicing all my whatever. And actually, this might be a little bit about what we were just talking about as well. So I had been practicing, kind of like a hybrid Reiki thing that I kind of had developed that I thought was really great, where I was doing this kind of rhythmic breathing, and I was visualization, and wow, like I was like really feeling like, you know, when I was doing treatments, like I was sweating, like they were like shaking, and there was like, it was like, wow, like this is really something going on. And I was at this Reiki share, and I have my hands on this guy's chest, this old man, and wow, it was like really intense feeling. And I was like, okay, I kind of want to like pick my hands up, because this is like, it's a little much, like what's happening right now. And I felt like this like magnetic pull where I couldn't pick my hands up, and I got like scared.
Oh,
And I was like, felt like, I felt like almost like being like electrocuted, not like quite electrocuted, but like this feeling of like, actually, but it is a little bit like, I remember one time I plugged in a dryer, like a drying machine, holding onto the plug, and like the metal part of the plug, and I had a that was more intense, but like, but 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 I couldn't let go. I knew, and like time like slowed down, and I knew I had to let go of the plug, but I couldn't. My fingers felt like they were like stuck to it. I felt like that a bit, where I was like really feeling like hot, sweating, and like my hands were like glued to this guy's chest. And I got like really like worried and like nervous. And and then I never went back to that Reiki share. I like stopped kind of practicing for a while, and I kind of went into like a little bit of like a dark period of my life, like where like I was like unhappy, like worried about my project and all this stuff. And yeah, I think now, like I think what I learned is that like, I think at the time I was really like in this mode of like, I can make this like more and more powerful, and more powerful is more better. And I think now, like when I practice, like, yeah, there's a lot of trying to like step out of the way, and like just like breathe and be present, and like pay attention to your hands and pay attention to your feelings, and like, um, you know, like pay attention to like if you're getting any feeling like you might want, and like, yeah, I don't have like as like intense sensations as I did at that time when I was doing that kind of practice. But at the same time, yeah, it does seem like it's a much healthier maybe practice that I learned out of that experience or something.
I love that. And it's funny because I think I call it the Reiki like dark night, like how do you call that in English? I think I
Yeah.
got it wrong. Yeah, but
Dark
it's but those are the experience like when we if we come back to the practice, then like transform us. So I love that you share that story because I went through something similar, like a lot of people are, but we don't share it because there is a part of us is like, I don't want to tell people I was scared to do Reiki, right? But I love that you shared it because I think a lot of people will resonate with that story. Thank you so much. That's what I love about this. Like, you know, like we all go through the same, and when we share it, like we also understand we're all in the same boat. So before I show you the drawing, I wanted to just ask you, I'm going to list obviously your website on the notes, on the podcast notes. I know you also have like recorded videos to go in depth in history. Is there something you want to mention? Because I know you have a lot of resources. This is
Mhm.
just an hour and you basically have years of wisdom and research. So should they go to your website, or is there any other thing that you want to check out so I can include it as well?
You know, I've been doing so much stuff. It's hard to say what's like the best, and also like different things for different people who have different interests. But um, and the problem is some of the things I did, like I did this whole like video series that was like a fundraiser, and it's only available, you know, for, you know, donation now. And I did, you know, I did some articles that are in journals that you have to be, you know, institutional access, whatever. I'd say if you go to my website, everything that I have for free, actually, I should upload also my YouTube stuff. There's a bunch of stuff I have on YouTube as well. If you just put me on YouTube, I mean, you could also find a lot of other interesting conversations I've had with other smart, interesting Reiki people out there. But if you're interested in reading something on my website, there's a lot of free resources. And if there's anything that you want to read that you aren't able to find, if you want to email me, steinjustin@gmail, I'm happy to send articles, you know, that are like subscriber only articles.
Oh, you just gave all the people watching this into your email. But yeah,
It's
they
okay.
can
Yeah, I
find it
mean,
on your website. Yes.
yeah, it's okay. The problem, the website has like a contact form, but sometimes I don't see when people, I think this happened with you, right? Did you
Yeah,
try
yeah.
to
I
kind of use
went
the website?
somewhere junky.
Yeah. So I don't always see that. I'm trying to figure out how to make that not happen anymore. But yeah, don't try to contact me through the contact form on my website. That I need to figure out a little bit better.
I'll include your email then because a lot of people like will be interested. And just so you'd ask me for tree, bird, and peace. I think were your three words to inspire the drawing. So this is what came out. And hold on, because my light is very strong.
Wow.
It's obviously the tree is all the leaves, and she's kind of a tree, but she's also kind of like a bird tree. So it's a little very free interpretation.
Cool. Yeah,
And
it's like wings, almost the leaves are like feathers too,
yeah,
maybe.
yeah. So it's like feathers, leaves. Then obviously there is the moon, there is the sun that is in a weird place, and then the
Yeah. Well, no,
river.
but the sun, it's like the hara.
Yeah. The
Yeah.
sun is the Hara, and then the river. I always do silver and gold for non-duality. So
Beautiful. Thank
thank
you so
you.
much. I love it. I
You're
love it.
welcome.
I can't wait to put it up.
Lovely inspiration, and I'll bother you for the address afterwards because you need to tell me it's Canada or here.
I
Or...
told everyone my email address already. I don't need to tell everyone my mailing address.
No, we're not giving. Then there are a lot of stuff. Like you're gonna have stands after this interview. Like they're gonna be stalking you at your place.
It's fun. It's fun. Yeah, doing the Reiki tours. I've done like a few of these tours in Japan, and it's like people who are like super Reiki nerds who like want to know everything. It's like we like wake up and they're like, we're having breakfast, and they're like, what about this and what about that, and like all day long, and like at the end of the day, like I have a good time. Like we're going to like these amazing places, we're eating amazing food, we're like but like by the end of the day I'm like, I need to just like sit for like somewhere quiet and like not think about Reiki history for like a little bit.
No more. New York has fantastic restaurant opens right now. You can just go and enjoy yourself. And there are some amazing painting exhibits as well. So you're in luck. As we get bad weather, we get good art. So that's the good thing.
That's true. That's true.
But there are no words to express my thanks. And like you, first of all, you opened my eyes so much to a lot of history because I am actually not a history nerd of Reiki. I know like at least kind of what happened, like the most basic things. So you really opened my eyes very much. And I really appreciate it. And I hope everyone who watched this video enjoys this as much as I do. And I'm sure they will.
Well, I really appreciate also, I think you also have a very kind of key-based sense of the practice and your martial arts experience, and I really appreciate that as well. And I find it really interesting how many, the Iaido, I don't actually know too many Reiki Iaido people, but a lot of Aikido people. And
if you meet an Iaido Reiki person, please send them my way. I'm like desperately finding, like looking for one. I know a lot of Aikido too.
Yeah.
Karate as well, Taekwondo, but I don't think I've met, there are not many Iaido people. Like I think we're like a few thousands in the world. Like you go to a big East Coast seminar and there's 100 of us. Like it's not the most popular martial arts. It's a very beautiful martial arts. Like it's for really self-improvement and it's very meditation and silent. But yeah, if you meet Iaido and Reiki, please. And if you're watching this and you do Iaido, please reach out. But yeah, I don't know. We have another string, and it's on the YouTube channel. We're interviewing now sensei for martial arts to get the spiritual side of that. And again, it's a lot more down to earth. So when we talk about Reiki, as you said, like a lot more, the key is just key. In martial arts, like, yeah, we just use key. What is spiritual about it? Like that word spiritual, it's taken more from the Japanese point of view. It's like self-improvement, becoming better people, and remembering that you are the universe, but without a lot of, so what? It's like, yeah, so we are the universe. So what? Can you go back?
That's the thing that I have a hard time, like, how do you translate that, right? That like, you're realizing that you are a Buddha, but like, you're also cleaning the toilet. That like, It's like at the same time, like,
Isn't that the best? Like, my monk, he cleaned the toilets, right? And then I remember we were in the monastery, everybody's like, why is the head monk clean the toilet? I'm like, because he knows we're not going to clean them well. Like, and I love that. They're like, he's the head monk, he's cleaning the toilets. Like, and yeah, I think martial arts, what it gave me was a sense of like, yeah, we all are centers of the universe. We still have to do our shit and be centered, you know? And in our case, center is important because we have swords. So you better don't go very spiritual in there, you know?
Yeah, you better be paying attention to what you're doing.
Yeah, you have to sign a stuff that says that you may die in the dojo and you're not suing anyone and no one in your family is suing.
Wow.
But no one has died yet.
That's good.
But I do think that it's a beautiful thing. So thank you so much. And I'm really grateful. I'll be sending you the drawing. And I could talk for you for hours. So I'm gonna let you go, but it's a hard one to let go.
Thanks, Nathalie.
Take care. Bye.
Pleasure. Bye.